Hi, I am Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. In this part of the lecture, we discuss some of the problems NCLB encountered and criticisms that were raised. Many of these criticisms were due to the compromises in the legislation. One compromise had to do with the way in which schools were being held accountable. NCLB said that each school had to make adequate yearly progress, AYP, toward reaching full proficiency by the year 2014. Paul, how did that work in practice?
Well, if you look at this graph, Chris, you can see that it was very unfair to those schools that had disadvantaged students and therefore were initially looked as if they were low-performing schools. That is the blue line in this graph. They got to get all the way up to that green line at the top, 100% proficiency by the year 2014. So for them to make adequate yearly progress, they got to make tremendous progress from one year to the next. Now, if you take the schools that are the red line in this graph, those suburban schools, let's say, where students come from advantaged backgrounds and they're already performing very well on the state proficiency tests, at least most of them are, they have to make some progress. But they're not going to run into a lot of difficulties demonstrating adequate yearly progress until they get very close to the year 2014.
But isn't it unfair to place a heavier burden on schools where students are initially performing at a lower level?
Yes, that's the problem with this. And if you look at the data from the early period, you'll see that schools that are in poverty communities have to show pretty remarkable gains in order to avoid being identified as failing. So if you look at this graph here, it shows the percentage of schools that were failing to make adequate yearly progress in 2005, just 3 years after NCLB had become law. And in the high poverty neighborhoods, 38% of those schools were identified as failing. In the medium poverty, it was only 15%, and in the low poverty areas, it's only 4%. Now later on, all schools are going to be identified as failing to make adequate yearly progress. But in the initial years, which is when this law is really being taken seriously, the weight of the law is falling very heavily on those schools in disadvantaged communities.
What would have been a better way to measure adequate yearly progress?
Well, scholars now have figured out that the only way you can really measure the quality of a school or a teacher or a classroom is by looking at the gains from one year to the next. There's two ways of evaluating student performance. One is to look at the level of that student's performance, and we do care about that. But another way is to say, okay, how much did they learn from one year to the next? How much did they learn this past year? And if you're going to evaluate schools or teachers, you should be looking at the growth from one year to the next, not the level of accomplishment that can be the culmination of many, many factors in a student's life.
How about the requirement that states set their own proficiency standards?
Well, that was another compromise, because if you had set up one standard nationwide, you would have had some states doing much better than others. And so to get the law passed in Congress, it had to be agreed that each state would do things according to how they viewed proficiency. So that's a big political advantage, because all political leaders can set up standards appropriate to their particular state and their particular circumstances. But with the passage of time, the great variation in state standards created odd situations where some states, such as North Carolina or even worse, Tennessee, had such low standards that nearly every student was found to be proficient, while other states, such as South Carolina, had such high standards that very few students were found to be proficient. Well, Tennessee corrected its standards and later on moved its standards up to the highest level in the country, right along states such as Massachusetts, which had originally set high standards. But one of the standard jokes about standards became a North Carolina student can slip from passing to failing simply by moving from North Carolina to South Carolina, because South Carolina had the more rigorous standards.
What happened when schools were actually identified as failing? What penalties and punishments were going to be applied to these schools?
Well, in the first year, nothing. In the second year, the consequences for schools were quite modest. If the school failed 2 years in a row, the only consequence was that students at that school could go to another school within the same district as long as that school was not failing as well. Only a tiny percentage of students ever took advantage of that opportunity, in large part because school administrators discouraged this migration from one school to another, and parents could be influenced by that. So the penalty was hardly a severe one.
What about if a school failed for 3 years in a row?
Then the penalty was almost weaker. The only thing that happened was that the school had to allow students to participate in a free after-school education program if they wanted to. Some students took advantage of the opportunity, and studies showed that they did learn in these after-school programs, but it's really hard to see how this is a penalty on the school. It's hard to object to giving needy students more educational opportunities.
Didn't schools have to be reconstituted after 5 years of failing consecutively, though?
Yes, this sounds like the most severe penalty, and it also often got played in the press as a terrible penalty because schools had to be identified as in need of reconstitution. But in fact, reconstitution was seldom as draconian as some of the provisions in the law implied. The law said that the school could be turned over to a private management group or given to a charter school, but that was hardly ever done. If you look at this graph here, you'll see that only in 1% of the situations was a school turned into a charter school, and only 1% was it given to a private entity, whereas usually either no action was taken at all or the action was limited to simply replacing the principal. So yes, even the most extreme provision of the law, the requirement that schools be reconstituted, was not actually implemented in a way that had much of an impact on local schools.
NCLB requires that by the year 2014, all students are to be proficient in math and reading. Did that actually happen?
Well, if you go by the NAEP standards of proficiency, which admittedly are high, only a third of the students in the 8th grade are proficient as of 2011, and very likely that's about the same in 2014. Even by lower state standards of proficiency, large percentages of students failed to reach the required level by the year 2014. So every school in the United States, just about, had become a failing school, making the provision of the law absurd on its face.
Why would Congress put into legislation goals that are so hard to obtain?
Well, a utopian goal is something that members of Congress like to promote, as long as it's way far in the future. And in this case, nobody ever expected NCLB to be around in the year 2014. As originally written, the law was to expire within 5 years by 2007, or at least rewritten so as to take into account some of its crazy provisions. But Congress could not agree on how to revise the law. You had the division of power between Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill and between Capitol Hill and the White House. And so it was impossible to come up with a new version of NCLB that was any more acceptable than the original version. Yet you had to keep the law on the books because it was part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provided the funds for the compensatory education program that every school district in the country wanted. Nobody wanted to end the compensatory education program, but nobody could agree, or at least they all couldn't agree, on how to change NCLB. So the years creep by, and the country moved closer and closer to the year 2014, and more schools were identified as failing, and the law seemed more and more unable to deal with the real situation in the country.
Is NCLB still the law today governing the compensatory education program? Is it still being enforced?
Well, the law is on the books in the year 2014, but it really isn't being enforced. And to understand how that happened, we are going to look at the question of national standards and Common Core standards and how that relates to NCLB in our next lecture. But to finish this lecture, let's get Martin West's assessment of No Child Left Behind. He is a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and he has also worked in Congress this past year, and he's watched the evolution of NCLB and the debates over the law since it was originally enacted, and we'll see how he views the implementation and effectiveness of the law and the chances for its revision. I have with me today Martin West, professor in the School of Education, the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. And he is an expert on many aspects of American education, but most particularly on No Child Left Behind, the legislation that the federal government passed in 2002. And it was way back about that time that he prepared the definitive book on this subject by that title, No Child Left Behind. So Marty, can you give me your observations on why No Child Left Behind lost popularity?
So why No Child Left Behind lost popularity? It did lose popularity, and people forget that it passed with such overwhelming support in the Congress. There's no doubt that it has become what Representative George Miller from California calls a tainted brand. I think in part, No Child Left Behind became less popular because it came to be blamed for many decisions that were made at the local level that may have been made prior to a law like No Child Left Behind being passed, such like decisions such as cutting arts programs, cutting extracurricular activities. Now No Child Left Behind became an easy scapegoat. You also did have a greater emphasis on testing, which many members of the public seem to welcome in many cases, but many employees and educators were less supportive of.
Well, did they have too utopian a goal? No Child Left Behind, in retrospect, seems like a little bit over the top.
Of course, it was too utopian a goal. I think No Child Left Behind, the particular design of its accountability system, is a lot easier to defend as something that was meant to work in the short run, maybe shock the system to some degree by setting very ambitious goals, and then being replaced by a more sensible, more pragmatic accountability system when it was scheduled for reauthorization, which was in 2007, just 5 years after the law was passed.
So why didn't they reauthorize it in 2007?
As you know, virtually every piece of major education legislation is overdue for reauthorization in Congress. It's become very difficult to get anything done in Congress, and education legislation is no exception. So I think part of it is just the situations of divided government we've had. But I think more fundamentally, there's a lack of consensus as to what needs to be done. What lessons should we draw from the No Child Left Behind experience? I think some people would say that what we learned from the No Child Left Behind experience is that the federal government can drive improvements by requiring more accountability of schools. Yes, there are some flaws with the No Child Left Behind accountability system, but if we fix those flaws, we can do an even better job going forward. And so this inclines many members of Congress, some interest groups, in the direction of looking for a more federal prescription when it comes to the design of accountability systems. Others draw exactly the opposite lesson. They say all the flaws of the No Child Left Behind system reveal how inept the federal government is, how ill positioned it is to be engaged in this type of activity, and they would rather see much more of a rollback. And it just hasn't been possible to reach a compromise between those two competing
did it
positions.
have, when it was really operating, did it have a big impact or didn't it?
Well, So I think the best evidence would suggest that the introduction of test-based accountability systems under No Child Left Behind in those states that were required to do so as a result of the law's passage did see modest improvements in student achievement, especially in math rather than in reading, and especially for disadvantaged students who are clearly the law's focus. And so I think there is some evidence to suggest that the law has done some good things. That evidence is very consistent with evidence from the 1990s when you saw states that were implementing the test-based accountability systems that became the model for No Child Left Behind. You saw them making faster gains on the National Assessment of Educational Progress than the states that didn't. So I think we've learned that I think No Child Left Behind did have some positive impacts, but they were quite modest, and they don't appear to be enough to in and of themselves to sort of shift the system onto a new trajectory of ever more improvement when it comes to student achievement. Even worse, I think to the extent that we don't address some of the flaws with the No Child Left Behind system, you run the risk of faltering public support for the basic concept of accountability. And that's some of what you're seeing now. It's what the Obama administration has been trying to address by granting waivers.
Well, this has been very instructive. Marty, thank you for joining me, and good luck on your endeavors.
Thanks for having me.